Well, hi and welcome to our meditations in Holy Week, and today is Good Friday. As you will know if you've been following us all week, these come from a book called The Book of Books by Trevor Dennis, and I'll be reading that. It's a story put together from all four Gospel writers, so that it's to be told as a story with all the aspects of each of those Gospel writers in it. Once I've read that, we will then have a meditation from the Nick Fawcett books through the eyes of one of the characters in the story, and we'll end with a prayer. Of course, today is a bit of a longer story because we have to get through all the events of Good Friday. So please do sit yourselves comfortably as we begin with the unfair trial. The soldiers led Jesus back into the city through the gate in the walls, along the narrow, winding streets. It was very late, and the streets were deserted. The sound of their feet echoed against the walls of the houses. They took him to the house of the high priest, where the chief priests, scribes, and elders were already gathered. They were expecting him. This was the Sanhedrin, the highest Jewish court in the land. Peter had been following the soldiers at a distance. After they disappeared indoors, he crept into the courtyard of the house. He could go no further. He would have to wait. It was a cold night, but fortunately there was a fire burning in a brazier. He crouched down close to it and spread his hands to the flames. There was no one else about. In a large room upstairs, the Sanhedrin put Jesus on trial. They were breaking their own rules by meeting at night, but that didn't matter to them. Justice didn't matter to them either. They just wanted to get rid of Jesus. The man was too much of a risk. He had challenged the whole operation of the temple. That couldn't be tolerated. They realised that Pilate, the Roman governor, would want Jesus dead just as much as they did, though for a very different reason. The soldiers would have heard people hailing Jesus as king. Surely he would see Jesus as a direct threat to his authority and to the authority of the Emperor of Rome. They would hand Jesus over to Pilate in the morning. They would need to get the crowd on their side as well, but that shouldn't be too difficult, they thought, at least as far as the people who lived in Jerusalem were concerned. Most of them depended on the temple for their livelihood, and Jesus was threatening to bring the temple to an end. As for the others, including the peasants from places like Galilee, Pilate would think of something. The trial was rigged. The priests had bribed some people to give evidence against Jesus, but some people said one thing, others another. Their evidence didn't agree. The high priest became impatient. Time was getting on, and they needed a proper case to put to Pilate, or they'd look stupid. Jesus wasn't helping matters either, as far as the high priest was concerned. He hadn't said a word. They'd been giving him a chance to answer the charges, but he'd kept silent the whole time, with his eyes fixed on the floor. "Have you nothing to say?" the high priest asked. "What about all those things that they're saying against you?" Jesus said nothing. The high priest lost his temper. "Look at you!" he shouted. "You're the Messiah, the Son of God, are you?" He laughed. Jesus raised his head and looked across at him. "I am," he said quietly. "And when I die, you will see the Son of God seated at God's right hand, coming with the clouds of heaven to defeat the forces of tyranny and put an end to the misery you cause. You think you have me in your power, but look more deeply. And when I die, look into the depths of God, and you will find me there." "This is blasphemy," cried the high priest. He tore his clothes to mark the end of the trial, and to show that the prisoner was a blasphemer. He looked around at the other members of the Sanhedrin. "We don't need any more witnesses," he said. "You've heard this blasphemy from his own lips. What sentence do you pass?" There was only one sentence that they could pass. Anyone convicted of blasphemy has to be put to death. "The man deserves to die," they cried. They gathered round Jesus. Some of them spat in his face. One person fastened a blindfold round his head and then started to hit him. "Come on, prophet," they yelled. "Let's have some prophecy." Then the temple guards took over and gave him a beating. While all this was going on, Peter was down below in the courtyard, still warming himself near the fire. It was nearly dawn. A few people were up already and going about their business. One of the high priest's servant girls came past and noticed Peter crouching there. The flames from the fire lit up his face. She stopped for a moment. "What's that man doing there?" she said to herself. She stared at him a bit harder. "Wait a minute, I think I recognise him. I was up in the temple the other day when that Jesus caused all the trouble. This man was with him, I'm sure of it." You were with Jesus, weren't you?" she said out loud. "That man from Nazareth, one who's been causing all the trouble." "I don't know what you're talking about," said Peter. He got up and went into the passage leading from the courtyard into the street. It was darker there, a better place to hide, perhaps. In the next street, a cock crowed. Time passed. There were quite a few people around now. The same servant girl came past the end of the passage. She saw Peter hiding there. "Hey!" she called out. "This man's one of Jesus' friends. I recognise him." Everyone stopped and stared at him. "I am not," Peter cried, his heart thumping. They all gathered round him. "Yes, you are," they exclaimed. "We can tell from your accent. You're from Galilee. You must be one of the friends." Peter was very frightened now. "I solemnly swear by God, the Lord of heaven and earth, I do not know the man you're talking about." At that moment the cock crowed for the second time. Peter remembered what Jesus had said, and when they were on their way to Gethsemane. "This very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." He broke down and wept. The morning arrived, and it was time to send Jesus to Pilate. So the priests tied Jesus' hands together and led him through the streets to the palace where Pilate was staying during the festival. Pilate was delighted that they'd managed to arrest Jesus without causing any disturbance in the city. He knew why they'd been so keen to get their hands on this man, but he didn't worry about any of that. All he was interested in was the report he'd received from his own troops that the Galilean was going round calling himself a king, and that he had a large crowd of followers who believed that he was. Apparently some children had been shouting, "God bless the king," inside the precincts of the temple. Clearly he had to get rid of this man, or he'd have a major riot on his hands, and the emperor back in Rome wouldn't be pleased at all. The emperor didn't like riots. Jesus was led into his presence. Pilate looked him up and down. His hands were tied and his face was bruised and swollen with the beatings he'd had from the temple guards. He could see people had been spitting on him. "So," he said, with a sneer in his voice, "you are this king I've been hearing about, are you?" "So you say," said Jesus. The chief priests leapt at once with their accusations. Pilate expected Jesus to defend himself, but he didn't. He seemed to know the game they were playing and was having nothing to do with it. Have you nothing to say? Pilate asked angrily. Look at all the charges they're bringing against you. Jesus remained silent. Pilate was astonished. In his experience, Jewish troublemakers usually had a great deal to say for themselves. But this man clearly wasn't frightened. Well, we'll have to see what the crowd thinks, won't we? He asked. They were in an upstairs room overlooking a large courtyard at the front of the palace. The courtyard was seething with people. Pilate looked down on them all. He had nothing but contempt for them. And yet he was still afraid of them. If some of them were supporters of this strange, silent Galilean, then they could return very nasty when he condemned him to death. It was a tricky situation. Fortunately, he had an idea. There was a man under guard in the palace called Barabbas. He was the leader of the Dagger Men. The Dagger Men, in the eyes of the Romans, were notorious Jewish terrorists. Barabbas and his gang had caused a riot and had stabbed several Roman soldiers to death. Pilate was waiting to have them crucified after the festival, once the pilgrims had gone home. But perhaps he could let Barabbas off after all. Barabbas was a broken man. The Roman torturers had done their work well. He wouldn't cause any more trouble, and the rest of his gang would be executed anyway. Pilate knew he wouldn't be taking any real risk if he released him. But the crowd wouldn't know that, of course. They'd like it if Barabbas was set free. He often released one of his prisoners at Passover to keep the crowds happy. They'd come to expect it. This time, he could give them a choice: Barabbas or Jesus. They could choose the one they liked best. Only he and the priests would see to it that they got Barabbas. Yes, Pilate thought to himself, this could work out very nicely. He gave orders for Barabbas to be fetched from the dungeons. Then he went over to the priests and explained his plan. The priests left the room and went outside to mingle with the crowd. There was a large platform out in the courtyard, and in the middle of it, a grand seat like a throne. Some soldiers escorted Pilate to the platform, and he sat down. More soldiers came behind him, leading Jesus and Barabbas. As you see, Pilate called out, pointing to Jesus, I've got your precious king. Would you like me to set him free for you? No, Barabbas, the crowd shouted. Those priests have done a good job, thought Pilate. Then what shall I do with this king? He asked the crowd. Crucify him, they yelled. Why? Said Pilate, pretending to be horrified. What's he done wrong? The crowd yelled all the louder, Crucify him! Crucify him! My word, said Pilate to himself, those priests are clever. Crucifixion's a Roman punishment. Getting Jews to call for a Jew to be crucified. Whoever had heard of such a thing? The priests had got them completely hysterical. Very well, he said to the crowd. I'll do as you say. He turned to the soldiers. Let Barabbas go. As for this Jesus, give him a good flogging and then crucify him. He got down from the platform and went inside the palace to get on with his work. It had all gone remarkably smoothly, he thought. The soldiers took the flogging very seriously. They knew just how far to go. Too many strokes of the whip and you could kill a man. Then you'd have no one to crucify. You had to get it just right. Nearly knock the life out of him, but not quite. When they'd finished, they took Jesus indoors to the part of the palace where the rest of the soldiers were gathered. Look what we've got, they called out. We've got the King of the Jews, we have. The others gathered round. "He doesn't look much of a king, does he?" one of them said. "Well, we'll have to dress him up," said another. "Come here, your majesty. We can do better than King of the Jews. We'll make you look like the emperor himself." "The emperor wears purple, so let's put this lovely purple cloak on you," they cried. "And the emperor wears a laurel wreath too. Oh, what a pity, your majesty. We don't have any laurel. But we do have this nice crown of thorns. You'll have to have this instead. Let's put it on for you. This is your coronation, your majesty." They jammed the crown of thorns onto Jesus' head and knelt in front of him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they shouted. They struck him around the head with a cane and spat on his face. The room was filled with their laughter. Finally, they'd had enough. They took the cloak off him, dressed him again in his peasant clothes, and led him out to crucify him. An officer called a centurion was in charge of the execution party. The soldiers hung a tablet round Jesus' neck. It had the words, "The King of the Jews," on it. Pilate wanted everyone to see what happened to people who dared challenge the Roman power. Jesus had to carry his own cross, or at least its horizontal beams, to the place of execution. It was heavy and difficult to manoeuvre through the narrow streets. He'd had too much of a beating. The torture had left him very weak, and his legs were like jelly. He collapsed on the ground, the beam of the cross falling on top of him. "Get up!" the centurion shouted and kicked him hard. It was no good. The strength wasn't in him. A Jew called Simon from the city of Cyrene on the North African coast happened to be passing by. "Hey, you!" the centurion called. "Come and carry this man's cross. We've got a job of work to do and we want to get it done before next week." So the little procession wound its way once more through the streets of Jerusalem. Some of the soldiers in the front, some at the rear with Jesus in the middle, and Simon lugging the cross behind. They came to a place outside the city walls called Golgotha, or the place of the skull. Some women offered Jesus some drugged wine to dull the pain, but he wouldn't take it. Then the soldiers stripped him naked and crucified him. They fixed a 2-meter piece of wood upright in the ground, nailed Jesus' wrists to the beam that Simon had been carrying, hauled him up with ropes, and tied and nailed the 2 parts of the cross together, and then nailed Jesus' feet to the vertical piece. Finally, they fixed the table with the King of the Jews on it just above his head. So now, at last, the king-making ceremonies were complete. Jesus was set on the cross for all to see. The cross was his throne. "Father God, forgive them," Jesus said, panting hard for breath. "They don't know what they're doing." The soldiers divided his clothes among them, casting lots to see which piece each of them should have. 2 bandits were crucified with Jesus, one on his left and one on his right. It was a noisy place. People had come to see the execution, and they started yelling abuse at Jesus. Even the chief priests and some of the scribes were there. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself." "Come on, Messiah," they all shouted. "Get down from the cross and we'll all believe you then." One of the bandits joined in the mockery. "You can save us at the same time," he shouted. "You're a fine one to talk," the other bandit cried. "This is your last chance to do something right. We know why we're here, but this man has done nothing wrong, and he is a king. I know it." He looked across at Jesus. Jesus, he said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I tell you, my friend, Jesus replied, this very day you will be with me in paradise. Meanwhile, standing near the cross were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to the other, Woman, here is your son. Then he said to the disciple, Here is your mother. 3 hours passed. It was noon. It was meant to be the brightest part of the day, but suddenly the sun disappeared and a thick darkness fell over the whole land. It was as if the sun had turned to ash, as if the whole of creation was in mourning. The darkness lasted for 3 more hours. The desolation was complete. Most of Jesus' friends had deserted him. Even God had abandoned him. At least that's what it seemed like. Those mock trials before the temple authorities and Pilate, the brutality of the temple guards and the Roman soldiers, the fearful pain, the continual fighting for breath, and now this strange, terrifying darkness, all seemed to have shut God out. He was nowhere to be seen, nowhere to be heard. Words of an ancient psalm filled Jesus' mind. He raised his head and yelled them into the dark. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why? 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 Then with one last great gasp, he died. At that very moment, in the temple inside the city, the great curtain separating the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, from the rest of the sanctuary, split from top to bottom. Jesus' death had brought God out into the open. They couldn't keep him hidden anymore. They couldn't pretend that only the high priests were good enough to enter his presence. In that darkness, beneath Jesus' cross, it had seemed almost as if God himself had died. In truth, Jesus' death had set God free. The centurion at the foot of the cross sensed the meaning of it all. He looked up at Jesus. This man was God's son, he cried. And so a meditation through the eyes of that centurion. It was dark, so very, very dark, like the dead of night, as black as sin. Nothing strange in that, of course, except that it was noon, the sun having blazed out of a cloudless sky just moments before. It was simply another ordinary day. Up till then, the usual routine executions to get through, and we'd watched impassively as the latest batch of ne'er-do-wells had suffered in the heat, crying out for water as they squirmed and writhed in agony. Did I feel anything for them? Not a thing. You get used to the screams after a time. But there was something about one of them this time which couldn't help but catch my attention. For there was a calmness about him, even, you might say, an air of authority, which left me flabbergasted, unable to believe quite what I was seeing. He was in a terrible state, his back an ugly mass of lacerations where the whip had bitten into him, and blood oozing from his head, his hands, his feet. Yet some, it seemed, felt even then he hadn't endured enough. They mocked, insulted, rebuked, tormented him, enough to make any ordinary man return their curses. Yet, can you believe this? I heard him with my own ears cry out, asking God to forgive them. Amazing. And when he died, it was more uncanny still. For I swear, as he drew his final breath, there was a look of triumph in his eyes, for all the world as though he believed that ghastly death of his had more meaning, some hidden purpose. Heaven knows what that could have been. Yet it was the darkness which got to me most. The way, without warning, literally out of the blue, the skies closed in as he hung there, and a cold and eerie hush seemed to cover the world. Coincidence, some called it, but not me. I saw enough to convince me that this man was special, innocent, without question, almost you might say, the Son of God. It's not like me to say that, for I am not a sentimental type, nor time usually for all that nonsense. But as I watched the man suffer, and when I finally saw him die, it was then that the light went out for me. The world suddenly more black than it had ever seemed before. It was dark, so very, very dark. So let's pray. Loving God, we recall with gratitude the faithfulness of Jesus, his faithfulness to the last, his willingness to take the way of the cross, his courage in the face of opposition, suffering, and death. Help us to respond, consecrating our lives to his service. Help us to be truly thankful for all he has done and continues to do. Help us to acknowledge him as Lord and Saviour, and to live today as his disciples. Amen.